The country of New Zealand has a remarkable safety record when it comes to aviation. When an air accident does occur in this small country, it receives a lot of attention. The crash of Ansett New Zealand Flight 703 was the first loss of a passenger plane since the 1979 Antarctica Disaster. Flight 703 is a case that involves a plane with a unique design, so we'll be taking a look at this plane today and the events that led to the loss of this aircraft. The morning of June 9, 1995. Ansett New Zealand Flight 703 was cruising over New Zealand's North Island. The plane had just left Auckland at 8:17 that morning for a roughly 1-hour flight south to Palmerston North, located in the south of New Zealand's North Island. On board were 21 passengers and crew. Up on the flight deck were two highly experienced pilots. 40-year-old Captain Garry Sotheran possessed nearly 8,000 total flight hours, flying a variety of different planes. His first officer that day was also rather experienced. 33-year-old Barry Brown had achieved 6,500 flight hours by the time of the accident. The rest of the occupants included 18 passengers and one flight attendant. Though the pilots were experienced, with a combined total of over 14,000 flight hours, they were both at least somewhat new to flying this particular plane, with 273 and 341 hours on this aircraft respectively. The plane is a de Havilland Dash 8-100. It's a rather small, Canadian-built twin turboprop commuter plane. It's actually the early generation of a family of aircraft that still fly today. To quickly summarize the story, the aircraft's manufacturer, de Havilland Canada, was a subsidiary of the British aircraft company which was originally known as de Havilland. When that company was consolidated into Hawker Siddeley, the Canadian offshoot continued on and produced some highly successful planes in their time. One of those successes was the Dash 8. There was a 100, 200, and 300 variant of the plane with varying size. De Havilland Canada as a company itself was privatized by the Canadian government in the 1980s and sold first to Boeing and then Bombardier in the 1990s, and it was in 1998 that the latest version of the plane took to the skies, the Q400, which is a common sight at airports all over the world to this day. Ansett New Zealand possessed 9 Dash 8s in the 100 and 300 versions. They were used on domestic flights all over New Zealand, based out of Auckland. The flight between Auckland and Palmerston North was Flight 703, and it just so happened to be that this particular plane was coincidentally named Palmerston North. June is the height of the winter in the southern hemisphere, and weather in New Zealand can be unpredictable. That day was one of those days. Thick overcast cloud layers covered the southern regions of the North Island, with patchy reports of rain showers. The airport at Palmerston North is very small. It has a single runway marked runway 0725. Runway 07 is preferred. They even geared the instrument approach equipment at the airport for use with landing in this direction. But if there is one thing the airport does not have, it's an ILS, or Instrument Landing System. Instead, instrument approaches at the airport used the VOR equipment that was positioned there. That day, the winds were unfavorable for runway 07, so 25 was used instead. Again, no ILS, and pilots would conduct a VOR DME approach. The pilots of Ansett 703 would have still preferred the 07 approach with a circle-to-land option for 25 if it was necessary. This, however, conflicted with other traffic at the airport, so when the pilots began their descent and approach to Palmerston North, the controller cleared them for the VOR DME for runway 25. A VOR DME approach is basically an instrument approach where the pilots can receive lateral guidance and distance information to the airport. The VOR does not help when it comes to altitude. Instead, they could use the distance information and consult their charts for altitude guidance. Here's how the approach went down. Ansett New Zealand Flight 703 joined a radial arc 14 miles out from Palmerston North Airport. They flew east past the airport to the north and would join the final approach path over the small town of Woodville. Now, between Woodville and the airport are a range of hills, which are actually part of the much larger Tararua mountain range. The pilots would watch their altitude once turning onto final and make their landing as expected. But of course, the weather that day was less than ideal, and they couldn't really see much outside. Their visibility was limited once they entered the cloud. Allow me to take a moment here to highlight that pilots who have flown in and out of Palmerston North expressed that in poor weather, they felt unsafe executing this approach, as the flight path takes them over the Tararua range of hills and gorges, an area known for its high winds. The 07 approach was always preferred, as it involved flying over the much flatter Manawatu Plains to the airport's west. Regardless, the pilots of Flight 703 accepted the 25 approach. As expected, Captain Sotheran and his co-pilot made the right-hand turn to line up for final, 14 miles east of the airport. During the turn, the throttles were reduced to the flight idle setting. The time was 9:20. Now heading towards the airport at around 4,000 feet, the pilots continued to prepare the plane for landing, extending the flaps and also at 12 miles, lowering the landing gear. Okay, this is where problems began to emerge. One of the unique features of the Dash 8 is its landing gear configuration. The main undercarriage landing gear is stowed in a wheel well compartment within the housing shared with the engine. As the wings of the plane happen to be fixed to the top of the fuselage, the engines and the landing gear hang down from the wings. So the landing gear has a very clear and obvious indication from a passenger's point of view as to whether or not it is deployed or stowed correctly. So imagine for a moment how you might feel as a passenger on one of these planes if only one of the main landing gear set had dropped and the other had failed to deploy. That's pretty much what happened here. The right side landing gear had failed to deploy and lock into position. Now when it comes to the Dash 8, this has always been a known issue. Specifically in this case, there was significant wear on the uplock latch that secures the undercarriage in flight. When the pilots lower the landing gear lever, the latch releases a roller which drops the landing gear. In this case, that didn't occur, because wear on the latch had prevented the roller from moving as intended. The roller had effectively worn down the metal and created a small trench which it sat in. De Havilland had created a solution to this problem by replacing the latch with one made of a stronger material, as this was something numerous airlines had reported. Ansett New Zealand were quite literally in the middle of fitting this modification on the Axton plane. The left side latch had already been replaced 2 months previously. The right side had not yet received this modification by the time of the accident. Of course, it was now too late to fix, a failure had already occurred. But de Havilland had also developed alternative ways for the landing gear to be lowered. So let's re-examine the Axton flight's events. Whilst on the approach, Captain Sotheran was handling the flight controls, and he instructed his first officer to consult the Dash 8's Quick Reference Handbook for procedures on how to manually lower the landing gear. The verbal communication on the flight deck suggested that the first officer would execute the necessary checklist whilst the captain flies the plane. The captain wanted to continue the approach and not delay landing. The flight attendant had actually entered the cockpit around this time, and it's not really known what she said here. The cockpit voice recording transcript leaves her speech blank. However, from the response from the crew, you could assume that the failed landing gear was noticed in the cabin. The captain would try to hurry the first officer along, because if they wanted to make this landing, they didn't really have the privilege of time. They were expected to land in a matter of minutes. So the captain encouraged the first officer to skip over a number of steps. It would appear that the first officer was struggling a little bit with this procedure. The captain, in addition to flying the plane, began to help his first officer through the checklist. Over the next moments, the plane's descent would begin to increase, until the Dash 8 was descending over twice as fast as it should, descending farther away from the expected glide path. Captain Sotheran's attention was diverted from primarily flying the plane to trying to troubleshoot the landing gear problem. The procedure to release the undercarriage in this scenario calls for a release handle to be pulled. It's located behind a door above the pilots. The first officer actually skipped this step in the checklist, and the captain needed to remind him to pull the handle. In the transcript, the first officer commented that he hadn't reached that step yet, but according to the checklist, it would appear that what he was referencing here was the nose landing gear steps, which came after. When the first officer did pull the handle, he didn't pull it hard enough and then went on to the next step. The next step was to open another door which led to a pump, and the landing gear then needed to be pumped into position. but because he never properly pulled the release handle, this wouldn't have worked. While all of this was going on, Flight 703 was nearing the terrain below, with thick cloud obscuring the view, the first officer concerned with running through this checklist and the captain helping him out. Neither of the two pilots noticed how far they had descended. Just 9 seconds after the first officer confirmed the landing gear release handle was pulled, the ground proximity warning system activated, warning the pilots that impact with the ground was imminent. The GPWS had provided the pilots with just 5 seconds of warning before impact. According to the CVR transcript, the warning was the last thing heard on the flight deck before the crash, though it was evident in the flight data that the pilots attempted to initiate a climb, but they just didn't have the necessary time. At 9:22 and 30 seconds, Ansett New Zealand Flight 703 impacted the top of a hill, crashed and skidded to a halt where the fuselage broke apart. 17 of the plane's occupants had survived, including the two pilots, but they had suffered injury. 3 passengers and the 1 flight attendant perished in the crash. The plane had crashed into a hilly farmland 8.5 miles east of Palmerston North Airport. Fortunately for 1995, 1 passenger possessed a mobile phone and actually called for help. It was cold and the weather was miserable. The 17 survivors were rescued, and there weren't any more deaths. This accident falls into the rather broad category of controlled flight into terrain. Despite the malfunctioning landing gear, it wasn't really the cause of the crash. Investigators identified multiple causal factors. Criticism was laid at the flight crew, namely the captain, for not keeping his attention on flying the plane, and his insistence on keeping the approach going whilst troubleshooting the landing gear problem. Other areas were also highlighted. Shortcomings in legislation and the airline's operating procedures, and their training in crew resource management were also contributing factors, not to mention operating in poor weather. The recommendations called for Ansett's Dash 8 pilots to be refamiliarized with the landing gear extension procedures. New rules were to be brought in so that pilots would abort a landing if abnormalities occur. When it comes to Ansett Flight 703, there is one last thing to cover here. The ground proximity warning system was supposed to have provided the pilots with ample time to avoid disaster. 4.5 seconds just doesn't cut it. It should have sounded much sooner, as it was supposed to. So what happened? Well, the GPWS interacted with the plane's radio altimeter, which broadcasted radio signals to the ground to display actual height above terrain. When a plane gets too close to the ground, the GPWS will activate. The thing is, the GPWS equipment had actually survived the crash in working condition, and even performed normally during the investigation's tests. Multiple theories were put forward, from radio interference from telecommunications infrastructure to the plane's own paint affecting radio sensors. But perhaps disappointingly, the investigation didn't come to a real conclusion as to why the ground proximity warning system behaved as it did, with a probable explanation being within the realm of a software bug. As for the Dash 8, we could easily make a video detailing the numerous events that have occurred over the years involving the Dash 8 and its landing gear issues. It's been a problem plaguing the planes even on its newer variants. Occasionally, even in the modern day, you will hear about the odd incident with the Dash 8. Former large operators of the planes, such as Scandinavian Airlines and the now defunct British airline Flybe, have both experienced several instances of failed landing gear deployment or collapse. So what became of the pilots of Flight 703? While neither of them worked for Ansett again, Captain Garry Sotheran in April of 2000 was charged with manslaughter in a move that angered pilots' associations. The captain was now unable to fly in New Zealand, and he would have to emigrate to continue his career. Captain Sotheran, along with First Officer Brown, were, however, both found not guilty following a 6-week trial which cleared them both of the charges. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. I know this one was a bit shorter, especially when compared to recent videos. This was a video that was requested a good while ago now actually, and I remember reading a small bit about this when I did the Mount Erebus video nearly 2 years ago now. There actually haven't been that many air disasters involving New Zealand. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to be subscribed, as there will be another video coming next weekend. Anyway, it is that time of the week where I must take a moment to thank my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their generous support to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now. A big thank you if you are on this list. Shout out this week to Jennifer Brown, who pledged last week. Thank you so much. And also a big thanks to Manuel Moore, who pledged at the highest tier last Saturday. Honestly, what a legend. Thank you so much. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new videos 2 days before they go out publicly on YouTube. If you'd also like to follow me on my Twitter page, that too will be linked in the pinned comment. That is all from me this week. Next week, we've got a video coming about a rather unusual plane, and it's actually quite horrific, so there's a warning in advance. Anyway, that's it from me today. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.